A very good morning to everyone. I, Tabassum Jahan, on behalf of the organizing committee, welcome Professor Sudhir Kumar, Professor Gajendra P.S. Raghava, Principal Professor Masroor Ahmad Beg, guests, participants and students. A very warm welcome to you all to this inaugural session of the 9 days national workshop on bioinformatics, resources, tools, and its applications to be held from July 19 to 27, 2021. The inception of the workshop was to impart basic knowledge to this recent and evolving field of bioinformatics in biology. This field of bioinformatics essentially integrates biology to computers, mathematics, and statistics, and has a wide range of applications in basic sciences as well as biochemical, biophysical, and medical sciences. It has become an integral and essential tool in almost all studies in the mentioned subject. Therefore, it is extremely important to familiarize our young minds with the different resources and tools available in this field. I'm really happy to share that we have got an overwhelming response from the students all over the country in their interest to participate and learn in the workshop. We have got more than 1,000 students registered in this workshop. I would also like to share that though we got requests from many researchers and faculties for their interest in the workshop to participate, but we wanted to restrict it to the basics in the subject so that it motivates the undergraduate students. We have prepared, I would like to say that we have prepared an e-manual also for this workshop, and I would like to present this e-manual before all of you, and we would be sharing this e-manual with the participants through mail soon. Can we have the e-manual? Please scroll it down. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Our principal sir would be joining us soon. Meanwhile, I would request Dr. Ratnam Vatal to welcome and introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Sudhir Kumar. Over to you, Dr. Vatal.
Thank you, Dr. Tabassum. Good morning, distinguished guest, Professor Sudhir Kumar, Professor Raghava, Principal Professor Baig, colleagues and participants from across the country. It is indeed a great honor for me to welcome Professor Sudhir Kumar, who's a torchbearer in the field of bioinformatics and a scientist par excellence. I must admit, it was indeed a joyous moment for all of us when we received your acceptance of our invitation to deliver the keynote address. We are indeed grateful to you for that. I would also like to express my gratitude to you for agreeing to deliver this lecture so late at night, Philadelphia time past 11 at night. Professor Sudhir Kumar is a leader in the theoretical and empirical intersection of evolutionary biology with computational biology. He has made numerous high-impact contributions to the mathematical theory of phylogenetics, leading the development of many impactful methods for inferring phylogenies, estimating divergence times and evolutionary distances, diagnosing disease mutations, and identifying genomic targets of selection. Recently, he has promoted the application of molecular evolution to the growing fields of phylomedicine and tumor biology that tackle disease via phylogenetic methods and make predictions informed by evolutionary biology. Dr. Kumar has been a major driver of widely used mega software and time tree database that have greatly enhanced the practice of molecular evolution and phylogenetics. Dr. Kumar is currently the Laura H. Carnell Professor of Biology and Director of the Institute for Genomics and Evolutionary Medicine at Temple University. His scholarly research articles and computer tools have been cited over 200,000 times, a large number indeed. He completed a PhD and postdoctoral work in genetics at Pennsylvania State University after receiving a dual degree in biological sciences and electrical and electronics engineering from the Birla Institute of Technology and Sciences, India. I'm sure your lecture will be a great source of inspiration and motivation to all the participants. I now invite Professor Sudhir Kumar to deliver the keynote address in the inaugural session. Over to Professor Kumar.
Hello, ma'am. Principal sir is soon joining. He is having the connectivity issue, so we may have the inaugural remarks.
So we'll request Professor Kumar to wait for Professor Baig.
I would request, sir.
Thank you. Actually, it is a rainy day in Delhi, and probably that is why the connectivity issue.
Good morning, everyone. There is one information to all the participants and non-registered participants. The e-manual of the workshop will be available after the session during a drive link that will be shared on your Telegram group, and it will also be sent to everyone through email. Thank you.
Hello.
He said, no, he'll talk in that. Okay. Oh. Professor Sudhir Kumar, I really apologize on behalf of the organizing committee for the delay in connectivity. Till then,
Oh, no problem.
Especially because it's so late at night in Philadelphia.
Oh, it's okay. No problem. It's not so late. It's only 11 p.m.
Yeah, that's very nice of you. So I just wanted to know now if you can talk about your association with Delhi University, and did you know about Delhi College earlier, or did you know only about the Zakir Hussain Delhi College?
Okay, wonderful. Thanks for asking me to talk about Delhi University, because as we were discussing earlier, before the meeting began, that I am from Delhi. I was born in Delhi, and I did my high school in Delhi from my childhood to the grade 12. When I finished my high school at Ramjas Senior Secondary School number 5 in Karol Bagh. And after that, actually, I went to Delhi University and joined Hansraj College in 1984, around July or August time when the semester begins. And so my connection with Delhi University is very old, and I was in Hansraj College for a few months, but then I got admission to go to BITS Pilani for a dual degree in biology and engineering, and so I left Delhi University because of that reason. But I spent a lot of time in DU in my early college days, in a sense, a few months, and it was really a very pleasant time at the time. And the interesting thing about the Delhi University was it's a really such a wonderful collection of colleges all around Delhi. At that point, I think they had almost 6 lakh students. I'm sure the number of students is much larger now. And so from my perspective, it's really wonderful to come back to Delhi University and be talking about this particular topic of interest for me at the institution where I really, for a very, very brief moment in time, began my academic career. But my connection to botany is also very old, because I joined the Department of Botany in Hansraj College.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful.
So from that perspective, I have a very old link with botany. And so when I received the invitation from Zishan and your organizing committee to speak, and I saw the signature line was Department of Botany at Delhi University, I thought this is really a wonderful place to go and reconnect with the roots that I have at Delhi University. So from that point of view, I have even deeper connection. And then I have connection to the area that you are located in, obviously Old Delhi, where I was born in Old Delhi, and I lived in Old Delhi until I went to college in BITS Pilani, and obviously Ajmeri Gate and Lal Killa and Sadr Bazaar and Dipti Ganj and all of those areas I am very familiar with because I spent my childhood there. So it's really wonderful to sort of have that feeling of nostalgia from that time. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures or selfies to show you or everyone to show, because in 1984, for all the people attending here, they may or may not appreciate, 1984 we didn't have smartphones. Yes. We have those really, let's say, dumb phones, and we didn't have any cameras around that we were taking around all the time, taking pictures. So because of that reason, we don't really have memories in the way that everybody captures them today. And so I don't have any pictures from that time from Delhi University, but it was really a wonderful time to be there. And it's really great to see that you have such a large group of undergraduate students interested in bioinformatics. And it's great to see that the botany departments are actually taking lead in this kind of an area to build bioinformatics to so many students and nationwide, not just in Delhi. So to me, it's really it's a great experience and privilege to be here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kumar. In fact, it's such a nice feeling that you accepted the invitation and you tried to connect to the roots. And I would like to add that you sound so much like one of us, though we were always in awe of you, as you are the star of the field of bioinformatics. And we always thought that, if Professor Kumar can make it, we have won the battle. So it was really like that. So thank you so much. Has Professor Beg joined?
I think he is not able to join. Ma'am, we can start
yes.
with
yes, Professor Kumar, yeah. Please start the lecture.
Okay, great, wonderful. So let me share my screen. Give me 1 second.
And one more thing to our dear participants, if they have any queries from our Professor Kumar, you can write your question in the chat box, which can be dealt at the end of the lecture.
Okay, great. You, sir. Thank you so much, Zishan. So as I just said a moment ago, it's really a great pleasure to be talking about evolutionary bioinformatics with so many young students and the faculty members in this in Zakir Hussain University, Zakir Hussain College, I should say, as well as many other faculty members in other institutions around Delhi and India regarding this really, in my view, really cool topic of big data and bioinformatics. And I'm thankful to Zishan, Professor Kaul, and others for inviting me to share some of my work with so many of you. Also, I really appreciate the kind words that I heard from Dr. Ratnam Kaul regarding my work. And as you know, we all get lucky sometimes. But the most important thing is to keep trying to do cool things, and some cool things many people like. And so that is sort of been my motto, that constantly do some interesting things and then ultimately some things will become used, appreciated. But I should tell you that when I first wrote the Mega software, I never imagined that many people will use it. I simply wrote it for myself primarily because I wanted to have an easy to use program. And but as time has told us, many people have the same need. So when you develop something, you create potentially a need or you fulfill a need, and then many other people can move forward. So it's really a pleasure to see that so many people are using such software that I developed a long time ago, and we have continued to develop it for the last, now almost 30 years. So it's a very long, what you say, tapasya, keep going for 30 years on the same topic, in addition to many other topics. And I'll talk about them today. So thank you for joining and for inviting me and giving me a chance to present some of the things we have done. So basically, this is a conference about bioinformatics, and bioinformatics today is about big data and small data. But generally, you will find that every time you'd want to do bioinformatics, data are really big. If you do a simple blast search, you get a lot of sequences. You want to build a phylogeny, you have many, many things to worry about, and there's a lot of information. And in fact, if you just track the number of genomes of humans or exomes that have been sequenced over time, this trend here in this particular picture shows you that it has been growing, and the number of human genomes or exomes being sequenced has been increasing continuously at a fast pace. And actually, we already have potentially 1 million of these genomes for humans available already. And the idea is that if it grows at the current pace, we may be on our path in the next few years to reach 1 billion genomes of humans. And these genomes are being acquired not simply in laboratories by researchers interested in the human genomic variation. They have been acquired in actual medical research, actual medical applications, cancers, different types of diseases. So a lot of data are coming out about the human genomes. And same actually is also true of coronavirus genomes. Coronavirus, which only began approximately 2 years ago, we already have 2 million or more genomes of coronaviruses that infect humans. So this capacity to sequence genome has been growing tremendously, and it's really impressive that we are generating such data. That is why in the past we used to say, oh, this is an astronomical data or sum of money, or the word astronomical was an adjective used for huge number. Maybe in the future people will say genomical. And this is the point that some of my colleagues made in a review article, that genomical might be the term because it's growing at a pace faster than Moore's law. As you can see here, that the growth is really extensive. And to put it in perspective further for you, excuse me, the sequencing capacity in the world is really growing very, very quickly. So sequence capacity initially was tera base pairs, which is not as large. It's a very large number. It's 1 billion times 1 billion. But it's now peta base pairs already. We have already surpassed peta base pairs. We are actually reaching exa base pair. And in a few years, by 2025, we may actually reach a number that we don't usually think about. It's zeta base pair. So this is an amount of information that will be out there. And a lot of this information will be biological. And this biological information would be very, very important information to analyze. And that's why people doing bioinformatics will be very important in the near future to understand what all of this is. And so I refer to all the situation that we are in today as a tsunami of data. I think this metaphor has been used many times in the past. And when the tsunami of this data comes in, we feel happy that we have so much data. But once we look at the data, try to download that on our computer, suddenly we go, oh my God, what to do with this? How do I search it? How do I analyze it? And the challenge is that we have to make sense of these data. Having data, raw data is one thing, but that is the raw information. We need to process this information and make it actionable, usable. And we need to do this, and we need to store, handle, refine, manage these data, which is also a big task that many of you will need to help do. So we need to not only analyze the data, we have to do every other thing. So I won't talk about some of these things today, since the time is 1 hour. It's not the whole 9-day workshop to discuss all these cool things that we have to do. But the data are here, they're big, and we need to participate in this enterprise. And so my interest in genomic data analysis is comparative genomics. So I am very interested in comparing genomes. And so if one chooses to look at very distant or diverged species, for example, humans, mice, you have mice here, and then you have a fish, and then you have a frog. So if you want to compare such distant species, you can start to see what is conserved among these species, which is all of these parts, and you can start to think they may be important functionally. If you look at species like apes, great apes, and humans, you might be able to see what makes them distinct, what makes humans different from other animals, other primates. So that's another way we can go, another level. And then you can actually look across humans to see why some people get some disease. Why do potentially some people have, in this case, heart disease, cystic fibrosis? Why do some individuals have a higher chance of getting coronavirus or dying from it? And so you can go from a very broad view to a more high resolution view. But you can look across all of this, and even below the human to human comparison is within a person. We have many people with cancer who have tumors, and tumors are evolving entities within an individual. So comparative genomics of tumors is another major field in which evolution happens within a person. So we have so many levels of evolution happening that require comparative genomics, and bioinformatics is the area that I'm interested in, and is something I think many of you are needed to be at the interface to solve the problems we face today and make new discoveries. And so I'm going to go to a little bit more standard things that I do, which some of you know my work from, is molecular evolution and phylogenetics. And ultimately, when you have a large number of sequences, the most important aspect is evolution and phylogenetic comparison, whatever your application might be. So what do you do in this area? What are we interested in? We're interested in building a phylogeny of species like human, chimp, gorilla, orangutan, or human, rodents, cows, and sheep, or populations, different populations of humans or other species, individuals. It is human history, for example, pathogens, SARS-CoV-2 phylogeny of the organism that causes COVID-19. We have built the first highly reliable SARS-CoV-2 phylogeny recently and published it. And now we understand, for example, that the strain in the Wuhan, first discovered in December 2019, was in fact not the ancestral strain, and the actual true ancestor was 3 mutations before it. So it was a great grandfather. And so therefore, the Wuhan strain is a great grandchild, for example. These kinds of discoveries cannot be made without doing phylogenetics. Timescale. Once you have a phylogeny, you want to know when these species or these pathogens emerged. And in this case, for the species, the question is about human-chimp divergence. When did they have a common ancestor? Human-mouse, when did they have a common ancestor? So this is an area in which we are doing a lot of work, building the time tree of life. But you see one of those renditions on the right side of the slide here. And origin of pathogens. When did the ancestor of SARS-CoV-2 exist? And so based on the phylogeny and the rate of change, we were able to estimate that the ancestor was already there by October 2019, and maybe even sooner, many months before the realization that COVID-19 was here in December. And so again, timescales are built using phylogenetics. And translation. And in addition to the translation I discussed, there is also need to be further translation on identifying which mutations are potentially causing disease, which particular change in a coronavirus made it more transmissible, or what is the connection between our genes and our behavior, traits, phenotypes, propensity to tolerate disease. So all of these are areas of interest. And I'll talk about a couple of these topics today, not all of them, in the context of bioinformatics and biological sciences. And then some of the work that I have done in the past are sort of captured in my textbook with Masatoshi Nei, which is now pretty old. 20 years ago, we published it, but it has some of the basic methods that are widely used today extensively. So let's sort of talk about molecular phylogenetics workflow. So many of you will be taking the workshop sessions that will introduce you to molecular phylogenetics. I saw that in your program. And here, the first thing you will be doing is, as you may have seen, building a multiple sequence alignment. The second thing you'll be doing is building a phylogeny from this alignment, which is a relationship of species. And the third thing, after you build the phylogeny, is to find out how much confidence do you have in the phylogeny you've inferred. So it is like, is the phylogeny that you've inferred really reliable, or it is somewhat flaky, like, uncertain? So generally in this field, the bootstrap approach is very commonly used to place confidence limits on the phylogeny. And so I'll talk about the bootstrap approach in a moment, and challenges of using bootstrap approach. And this bootstrap approach is a really powerful approach that can be used in almost any field of statistics or any application. In phylogenetics, it is the most popular approach. You may not realize, but more than 40,000 research articles have cited the use of bootstrap approach in phylogenetics. So it is very, very powerful. And it was first proposed in 1985 by Felsenstein. Joe Felsenstein introduced Efron's bootstrap approach to molecular phylogenetics. So it was originally Bradley Efron's approach, which was tailored for use in molecular phylogenetics by Joe Felsenstein. And essentially that original approach is still used. So what is that approach? Some of you may not know about that approach, so let me explain that, and then let me explain why it is very difficult today for big data. First of all, I'm showing you a sequence alignment, very small one, which I will call full data set. And I'm going to show you this little strip of vertical lines. They are representing positions in a sequence alignment, and I'll just use that in the rest of the flowchart for the simplicity. So in the bootstrap approach, you take the full data set and you select positions without, positions with replacement. Just randomly select any position from the big data set here. So you basically select one of the position here and you add it here. Then another one, add it here. Randomly take the third one, add it here, until you have a data set that has the same size as the original data set. And this is called bootstrap resample. And this data set is different from the original data set, the black one. The orange is different from the black because orange may be missing some positions and it may have other positions which are duplicated or triplicated. And you take this new data set, which we call pseudo data set, and you do likelihood analysis, for example. Then you get a phylogeny and you say, OK, great, I got a phylogeny. Then you repeat this kind of process again, and you get a phylogeny again. You repeat this process once more, get another phylogeny. And then you repeat this process another time, maybe R times, 100 times, 50 times, and you get another one. And essentially all of these trees are likely slightly different from the original tree because you have not given the same data to the likelihood method. You have perturbed the data. And what Bootstrap does is it examines how much perturbation of the data affect your result. And so you take the data from all of this and aggregate the result. and essentially you get a bootstrap tree. So what you get a tree like this. It's a phylogeny of a bunch of mammals, and in this phylogeny you see the numbers on the branch, and these numbers are like 95%, 99%, 100%. So when you see these numbers, like 99% human chimp, it tells you that humans are close to chimp in this phylogeny as compared to the relationship with macaque, 99% confidence. 100% confidence that these are one group as compared to going with marmoset. That means humans are not close to marmoset, neither are chimp nor a macaque. It also tells you seals are closer to bears than they are to cats. So these are very high confidence. But there are certain parts in this tree that are unstable, we call them. 87%, 68%, 32%. So their confidence is lower than 95%. And 95% is sort of a gold standard confidence many people like. And so this is what Bootstrap tells you, that your phylogeny is very stable in some parts and other parts are sort of iffy. And what's happened in the field of phylogenomics, that we know that if we have more data, that means more genes, many more genes. If you have only 10 genes and you got this phylogeny, then if you get another 100 genes, you are very likely to be able to increase this bootstrap support and get the correct relationship and increase the support. It's highly likely. And so this has led to Gold Rush to make big phylogenomic data set. And alignments are now becoming longer and longer. Number of genes are more and more all the time. Excuse me. And so, for example, in the past, the data set will contain 1 gene, 2 genes, 5 genes. Now they contain 100 genes. For example, 60,000 sites, 89,000 sites, 135,000 sites for a plant data set containing 30 species, a spiders data set with 137,000 sites, an insect data set with 3 million sites, a plant data set again, another one with 4 million sites, a data set of butterflies, 61 species, 5 million sites. Such huge data sets are being assembled, which were previously unimaginable, to resolve the relationships that are hard to tell from small data sets. And so this is very big and really cool. So the problem is, though, bootstrapping a phylogeny for such data set is very expensive. And bioinformatics can be done, but it's very, very expensive. So suppose you take this data set that I have highlighted here in red, which is a mammalian data set, 37 species only, but 1.3 million sites, and you want to compute a likelihood tree. It will require 3 gigs of RAM. So if you have a desktop computer, it will be with a 4 gig of RAM data, with 4 gigs of RAM, your computer will be busy. For how long? 40 days. For likelihood phylogeny, for this data set will require 980 CPU hours, means 100 for just 100 replicates of Bootstrap. Generally, you're supposed to do more replicates, but even for 100, it will require 40 days. Even just one replicate will require you almost 10 hours. So that means that computer will be busy. And now, if you live in a country where the power supply is not 100% assured at all times, you will never finish your analysis. Basically, even with a backup power supply, and the computer may burn out before that due to overheating. So this is the problem. The bootstrapping has become very expensive, and only a few people can afford to do it. For big data, small data sets are easy. And if you want to teach your students, it's going to be very difficult for them all. So this is the problem. And so slow and memory hungry computing is the problem. We need many computers and facilities to finish bootstrapping. High memory needs means you can't really do parallelization. If it requires already 3 gigs, your computer has to have 16 gigs before you can even do multiple threads. And so it means phylogenomics is not really accessible. So big data computing is not accessible to everyone in research and teaching. It is really in some sense elitist. So slow computing hurts. What? It hurts scientific accuracy, because Bootstrap replicates you can do even if you have computers and have resources is still difficult to do. Reproducibility. Once you analyze data once, that's it. If you want to change one gene or remove one species or try different combinations, that's not possible. So, and other people can reanalyze your data. And so reproducibility hurts. Scientific rigor. If you want to try different assumptions or different ways of analysis, different heuristics, that is very difficult to do. So essentially, time and memory expensive computing is very detrimental to scientific endeavor, to scientific process. And actually, this is, I think, the biggest issue today in the big data world, how to reduce this memory and time footprint. So we have recently published almost accepted paper that actually takes a divide and conquer approach to solve this problem. And this approach that I'm going to describe to you is our introduction with, I think, some cute modifications of some work by Kleiner et al. In 2014, in which they proposed to do bootstrapping on small subsamples of data, but still have the same accuracy as full data set, full bootstrapping. So again, we start with the same kind of bootstrap, same kind of data set representation, a strip of positions. And what we do in this case is we actually take a random set of sites, but only a few positions. Only a few positions from this whole thing. Maybe 1% of the data, 5% of the sites, but not all. And then we bootstrap. But we bootstrap with what we call the upsampling procedure. I won't describe it here because it will unnecessarily cause time wastage. You can read about this. A preprint is available online, exactly what happens. But that's what we do. So we bootstrap this little sample and it's very fast. Okay, little sample number 2. Sample from here again, 2% data, and again do bootstrap. Sample again, bootstrap. Sample once again. And you can do 5, 10, 20 samples. We found even 5 samples sometimes work. That means only 5 samples of 2% data, only 10% data being analyzed or less, but every time very small data set. Bootstrap, 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 and then we have a simple way of aggregating these bootstrap results statistically. So it's called bagging, and you get the result. And so is it really worth doing? How much time can it save? So let's show you how much time it takes. Little bootstrapping is actually very cheap. Standard bootstrap, for each replicate, it required almost 10 hours. Little bootstrap, 20 minutes, 15 minutes, 10 minutes, and you're done. 0.3 hours. So in this case, 0.3 hours will be 20 minutes. Memory, standard bootstrap 3.1 gigabytes, little bootstrap 0.1 gigs. One day I could do this on my iPad or maybe smartphone. Little sample size that I used in this analysis, only 1.5% of the data. And so I'm able to do this. We are able to do this by analyzing this humongous data set, but chunk by chunk in a smart way. It's not that straightforward, but now that we know how to do it, it's very, very obvious. So what does that mean? Let's say you have a common desktop CPU desktop with 4 gigs of RAM and a quad core CPU. How long does it take? Regular bootstrap, 980 hours, that's 40 days. Little bootstrap, only 32 days, only 1.5 days. But 1 day and 8 hours, it's not so bad. But quad core CPU, so you have multiple cores available. So let's say you use all the 3 cores that are available outside of operating system. It's only 11 hours. So you can get the result the same day rather than the next month. So that's not bad. Plus, we developed an adaptive method to take the little bootstrap and automatically know when to stop computing. And that reduces the time by another, in this case, 30%. So within 7 hours, you have the result. Then we realized, oh, you can couple that with some other optimizations in the field. And one of them is ultra-fast bootstrap that can be combined with ours, little bootstrap, within 2 hours. So you went from come back next month to come back after lunch. So this can change our life. Now anybody can compute using regular computers that are found in personal workstations. And so this is the kind of need we have for big data. Now the question is it really good? Does it really work? Well, here is the accuracy of results. Highly supported partitions, which is what we care about in big data, that have 95% bootstrap support, they are almost always recovered. Essentially once or twice they are slightly lower bootstrap than standard bootstrap, but they're almost always recovered. And actually, when they're not being recovered, it may not be the deficiency of little bootstrap approach, but the fact that the bootstrap method itself can be biased, which I'm not going to discuss here today, but to just let you know that it's really cool that we can now do these kinds of analyses so quickly. So this gives you an idea that in big data analysis, there are many challenges, and data acquisition is not one of them. In this case, it is to be able to do compute anytime on demand with high probability and with less resources. So my halfway conclusion is, or more than halfway conclusion is, the little bootstrap speeds up analysis, requires much less time and memory, and you can parallelize your calculations even on a personal desktop. It can be combined with other heuristics. So you can basically multiply your gains. You can try it, of course, it's online, available on GitHub currently as a pipeline. But we are adding it to Mega. Hopefully in a month or two, we will have a beta version of Mega that adds little bootstrap into Mega for everyone to use. And so you will then be able to just quickly get the results, even for big data, for teaching, for research, for testing, for examining results again from other people. This would change the way we used to do science when it comes to bootstrapping in phylogenomics. And so this paper should appear in Nature Computational Science some point in the next few months. So after this, I will now change gears and talk about what happens after you have a phylogeny. Once you have a phylogeny, we want to add time on the nodes. What is the time of divergence of each pair of lineages on the tree? And the times are really necessary in ecology and evolution to understand macro and micro processes. They're important in development. If you have multi-gene family, for example, to know when gene duplications happened, then you need to know when the species originated and when the gene duplications happened. They're also important in genomics because times are what you need to estimate the absolute rates of evolution and also maybe spurts of selection. So time scales, divergence times are important to be added to phylogeny in many scenarios. And estimation of divergence time is done in a very simple way. You can have a phylogeny. For example, I have a phylogeny here of 7 species, and you can take a sequence alignment, some calibrations, fossil record information, combine them in statistical methodology, and build a time tree. And these time trees will tell you information about when did different speciation events happen. In this case, A and B had a common ancestor here around 1 million years ago, whereas all of the major groups diverged between 5 to 3 million years time frame. This divergence happened around 11 million years. So this is kind of inference that is very interesting to a number of people. The method for molecular dating have been around since 1960s, like 60 years of history. And the one that is used the most today are the Bayesian methods that began development in early 2000s. But these methods are very time consuming. As you know, Bayesian methods are based on likelihood, and they require a large number of calculations and to develop posteriors, so they are very time consuming. We realized that many years ago and began developing faster methods, and we developed a method called RealTime, which is an algebraic method. It doesn't do likelihood in the way that Bayesian methods do. It uses algebra, and initially we developed it as an algorithm, and we showed it works really well. So that is what I'll talk about a little bit more about what we did in this method and why it is interesting. So first we developed an algorithm, but a couple of years ago I was able to actually prove it algebraically. And here the problem is shown to you in a 3 species 1, 2, and 3 system, species 1, 2, and 3 with an outgroup. And B1, B2, B3 are branch lengths. R1, R2, R3 are rates of evolution, Rs, and T4 and T5 is what we want to estimate. So essentially this is our interest. And in this case, we want to use algebra. So we decided that we will express this relationship of R1, R2, R3. So basically what you have in reality, before I say anything else, are branch lengths. So every tree has branch lengths.
Mummy, kasto pani diyo?
All of these B1, B2, B3, and B4 have branch lengths. And then these branch lengths have a relationship that we can write down based on the T4 is the time of divergence between 1 and 2, if we don't know it, and T5 is between 1, 2, and 3. So if you write it down, you can actually express this whole thing as a system of ratios and equations. R1 divided by R2, which is R1 divided by R2, is B1 divided by B2. So this is a relative rate, can be estimated between these lineages 1 and 2 by dividing branch length B1 and B2, which is obvious for people studying this mathematically. And R3, which is here, divided by RA, which is this whole lineage, is B3, this one, divided by LA, which is this length. So these lengths are already known. What we have to do is somehow estimate R1, R2, R3, and then we are done. So we were able to, by using simple algebra, prove that it can be done. And it can be done in a split of a second, basically. So we went from Bayesian method taking a long time to this method taking almost no time. And so actually, if you look at it, on the left here, I'm showing a picture of number of sequences on the x-axis and runtime time taken. So for even 500 sequences, it will only take 100 seconds or 200 seconds. So only a few minutes, real time. But Bayesian method may take days, sometimes may never finish, definitely many hours. In fact, for some data sets we simulated, Bayesian method took 10,000 times longer than real time. So this is another big data or big computing problem. And does it really work is the question. So here is a picture where we applied this to a published article in PNAS, where you have this data set of 138 species, 64 calibrations, 11,000 positions. It's a relatively big data set. And we applied our method, which is real time here, and compare the result to the published work. And you can see the relationship is really nice. And so this gives you an idea that it is possible to develop very fast method that doesn't do what everybody else is doing and can actually solve the problem we have of computing too much. In fact, that was just one example. After that, we did many examples. And on the right side is simulations in which we show that actually, if you simulate evolution on this tree and estimate times using real time, then you get really good result. And then similarly on this tree, which is not at all constant rate like in any sense of imagination, again, real time can do really well. And on the left side are empirical data sets of mammals and spiders and animals and insects and birds. And they show the results are really similar, except for this one data set where we showed that actually Bayesian methods were having difficulty with the good posterior. So it is not really a problem of dwell time as much as potentially a Bayesian approach. So again, the point I want to make here is that in today's big data, using computationally heavy tools is a problem, and actually one can develop really fast methods that are extremely accurate at the same time without sacrificing anything. And then, of course, more recently, we have advanced dwell time from species divergence times, which is on the left shown here, where times are often in millions of years, and you have lots of species, to, in this case, swine. So these are different kind of avian flu, influenza, phylogenies in which evolution happens over years or tens of years, and it's not at all constant rate like, and you have data from 1980s, 2000, 2010. So lots of data. This is H1N2, so you can see it's a flu data set. So we have extended dwell time framework for pathogen time tree building. So over the last 10 years, we have constantly made this relative rate framework to build time more and more rich, such that you can do node dating, you can do tip dating, which is the pathogen timing. You can actually use dwell time to estimate core test, to estimate properties of autocorrelation of weights in clocks. You can add fossil calibrations to estimating time in real time, just like you can do in Bayesian methods. You can actually infer confidence intervals of real time estimates that are actually extremely fast and extremely powerful. And of course, we have added real time to Mega. So you are able to use it. So if you want to know about real time, rapid methods and real time, you can read the review from my website that my grad student and I wrote together. And just to show you how you can use this in Mega, because I'm expecting that you thought I should talk about Mega just a little bit at least, is that in the version, this is a slide from version 10 of Mega, but version 11 was just released a few months ago, and that version is much faster. It has much less memory requirement, but I'll talk about version 10's screenshots because they are virtually identical. And so you can actually estimate all of these times using a simple menu compute time tree, and you have many different ways you can compute time trees, including the trees with only branch lengths can be used to compute time trees in Mega. And of course, Mega is available on Windows, Mac, and Linux. It's native GUI versions that are natively compiled, so there is no loss of function or speed. And so essentially, in Mega GUI, you will first essentially start with the sequence data. You open the sequence data, as you can see here. Then you will say one way to do it is to use real time in Mega is to construct a phylogeny like maximum likelihood tree. And you get all these options to select from. Once you select these options, then Mega produces a phylogeny, and this phylogeny is of great apes, human, chimp, bonobo, gorilla, orangutan, gibbon, rooted on the gibbon, which is the outgroup. And if you look at the top bar, you will see this very simple little time clock. And this time clock gives you access to real time from Tree Explorer. You can also directly do it from the main menu. A wizard comes up, and this wizard will walk you through the problem because there are many steps involved. And after you select taxa or species that you're interested in or sequences, you have to add calibration if you wish. You don't need it, but if you wish to add them, you can add them. And we have now allowed people to use many different types of calibrations. You can use calibration that are normally distributed, uniformly distributed. There are min time, max time. And so you can see how your calibration density looks like. After you select all of that, you get a time tree. And this time tree is a very straightforward time tree. It tells you that chimp and bonobo have a time of divergence of 2.4 million years. These are pygmy chimps and common chimps. That's actually the time that often we believe is the real divergence time. Homo sapiens, human chimp, around 7 million years. Human chimp gorilla, around 9 million years. So this gives you this information immediately. And then Mega, so basically that's how you can build time tree in Mega. There is a lot of other features in Mega when you explore it. So if you give that a try, you will see. Now, Mega is also available to be used on a command line. So this is a command line version called Mega CC or MCC. And Mega CC on command line provides you all the functions Mega has. You can compute anything in Mega through command line. And the best part is you don't have to learn any commands, except, of course, scripting commands on the command line. And it was published now almost 10 years ago, but we have made it better and better all the time. That there is a feature called prototype. If you click the prototype feature, then in this feature, you can just go to compute time tree, for example, and it will show you this kind of an option without any data. You didn't have to give any data, but it has a save settings. So you can select whatever settings you like right here and save the settings. And then after that, you can call Mega CC with a bunch of options on where the data are, where the tree is, where do you want the outputs to go, where the calibrations are. And then voila, it will actually work. And you can do this for pairwise distance estimation. You can do this for model selection. You can do this for neighbor joining, phylogeny building. You can do this for dating analysis, selection analysis. Every feature function calculation in Mega is available through Mega CC on command line, including actually alignment using muscle and Glustal. So essentially, you can now prototype in Mega and then use command lines. So you don't have to learn any commands. Everything is great. There is no problem to worry about. So this is really meant for researchers who sometimes may not be comfortable with, trying to learn all the commands that can change anytime for software programs. So this is what we have done in Mega CC. So Mega CC is it comes in all the three flavors. And many different versions of Linux and Mac OS and Windows. And so I want to conclude in general that big data in genomics is all around us. In fact, genomics is a big data science. I don't think there are really any small data sets in genomics. The analysis of these data require too much time and memory. And it makes computing restricted to elites. Elites here, I mean, is people with resources, maybe too many resources sometimes. We need to make traditional methods faster and leaner. I showed you the little bootstrap is one such method. Develop new methods that are fast and lean, like RelTime. It doesn't matter what tree you have, what data you have. RelTime can be done on thousands of sequences together. A tree can have 10,000 leaves. RelTime will be extremely fast. And we may have to evolve beyond evolutionary model-based methods, which are the methods, in which you choose a substitution model and you do stochastic processes and you have this likelihood calculation. Maybe we can use machine learning, and now it is becoming popular in the field. And we have recently proposed an evolutionary sparse learning approach, ESL, which you can find on my website if you're interested in. It is called Evolutionary Sparse Learning for Phylogenomics, which can also speed up some of the functions we need. These are not replacements for everything, but we need to constantly develop these better methods, faster methods, leaner methods. And benefits are higher reproducibility and greater scientific rigor. It is good for the researcher who is doing it. It is good for others who need to redo it. And it is good for us to be able to compute better. Also, it will lead to much more global participation in research. Anybody in a village with a reasonable size, with a small computer even, and limited power could actually also still do research, because creativity is hidden everywhere. It's like every city, every village, every country, every mohalla, let's say, every place has very smart people. Sometimes they just don't have the ability, means, or tools to be creative. So we hope that's what happens when we have such fast methods and lean methods. And ultimately, it is more environmentally friendly. Less time to compute means less carbon emission, because every time a computer runs, it consumes energy, and often the energy comes from different types of non-renewable sources. So carbon emission is less, better it is for our environment. So it is really win-win-win situation for all of us if we do green computing. And so, so before I tell you some acknowledgements, I wanted to just leave you with this picture of the tree of life, which has been assembled. We have assembled from thousands of studies, which have published molecular time trees, and we have this major project to assemble the biggest time tree of life on Earth. Right now, this number is 100,000 species, and we are releasing one with more than 140,000 species soon. And you can access this time tree on timetree.org website given here. But the point I wanted to make is that this time tree was also used by David Attenborough as a backbone and constantly displayed in many different forms in the Rise of Animals series. It has global impact. And so this data management and curation and synthesis, which is what this project represents, is another place you may find some cool things to visualize and explore. And so, so I want to end by thanking my graduate student Sudeep Sharma, who worked on Little Bootstrap approach, my colleague Koichiro Tamura and Glenn Stetcher for Mega, what they have done with me on Mega, my colleagues Fabia, Beatrice, Sayaka, and Shishing, all my previous students, postdocs or current students, all of whom have worked on molecular timing studies, and all the funding agencies for their support, and for you to be listening to me for so long. And by the way, all my papers are available on kumarlab.net as PDFs. So just go there to publications page, and you'll be able to see everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. It was indeed a great pleasure for us to hear you. And I would like to inform you that our undergraduate students of third year, they also have a syllabus that deals with the Mega software. So they learn about the Mega softwares and learn about the phylogenetic analysis. And now we have received several questions. I hope you would like to address to some of them. Sure. So the first question is that what is your all-time favorite piece of bioinformatics software and why?
Well, of course, this is a trick question. So my favorite software is, of course, Mega, because I love developing it and I love working on it. But beyond Mega, I think for everybody in bioinformatics, BLAST would be one of our most favorite software tool that really revolutionized. So think of Google as something that finds you what you want. BLAST finds you what you want the same way. So I would say the importance of BLAST in our field is as much as that of Google in our personal lives now. So yeah, I think I would say BLAST is my favorite tool after Mega in bioinformatics, I should say.
Okay. Next question is, are there any chances of developing a software that can predict possible future evolution?
Yes. So basically, we can always predict. We can always estimate the future substitutions at a position in a protein sequence alignment and based on what we know. So we actually developed a method called evolutionary probabilities method, where given a phylogeny and given alignment, we could predict what would be expected to be found in a species at a position. And so you can predict what are the probabilities of different amino acids at a position in an alignment. And we did that, and actually we applied this to the human genome, human exome, and we found that all the mutations or all the alleles that were expected to be or that were predicted to be less than 5% probable, all of them were really good predictor of disease mutations. So when we took 50,000 disease mutations and estimated our success rate in predicting them using this EP method, we were actually 91% successful. So yes, we can predict what will be bad, but we cannot predict for you what will be good. And but you know, but you cannot really predict. So this is sort of a simplest prediction, even though it is still complex and sophisticated. It is a simple prediction. But you can ask the question, can you predict what would be the next coronavirus strain? And the point is that we can predict what kind of positions will have the next coronavirus mutation and what are the chances. But which mutation and which coronavirus variant will become common among people, that can be predicted because it depends on chance, it depends on demography or the person who has that mutation, whether they go to a big wedding and give it to everybody or not. Those things you cannot predict from evolutionary biology. Those are chance events. So by chance alone, many things happen in evolutionary biology. So that's why you cannot predict that kind of future evolution. But I can definitely predict to you is that if many people get sick with coronavirus, there will be many more variants. I guarantee you that, and I can tell you how many variants there will be and how common they will be, because those are all estimatable by evolutionary biology.
So there is one technical question which says, why is that there are some changes in result while performing little bootstrap instead of standard bootstrap?
That's a great question. Why don't we get 100% perfection result? So actually we know that in the bootstrap method, that suppose you begin with 100 genes and you do a bootstrap and you get for a branch 99% support. Then you remove one gene and suddenly this branch gets only 50% support. And we know that from many papers that bootstrap method is quite sensitive sometimes to removal of just one gene. And in fact, that is considered a bad problem with bootstrap. It is too biased. That sometimes you can have a gene or even sometimes a few sites that can mislead bootstrap. So actually the fact that little bootstrap tells you when the standard bootstrap is different, indicates a little bootstrap has less sensitivity to these kinds of genes. And so we are investigating a new approach to show that little bootstrap may actually produce more unbiased results. Like many times people do coalescence analysis rather than concatenation analysis, and they find that concatenation analysis doesn't do as well as coalescence. Actually, little bootstrap may even solve that problem. So we are optimistic about that. So I think the fact that we don't have perfect result is highly expected and is reasonable because bootstrap is too sensitive sometimes to inclusion and exclusion of genes, which is theoretically not expected.
There is some one unrelated question, but I hope you would like to address. Scientists in 2017 announced about the successful creation of the first human pig chimeric embryo that consists mostly pig cells and human cells. Without considering the ethical and religious aspect, is it possible to ensure that these creatures would not create terror in future?
Now, you know, that's a sci-fi question. It's a great sci-fi question. And And creating hybrids is very common in agriculture. All the time you're creating hybrids. You have plums and different types of fruits are being married together. So is creating hybrid with humans or animals ethical or unethical? This is the topic that I personally have not worried or thought so much about because these are hybridizations that will actually kill evolutionary history. It makes evolutionary history tracing very difficult when you have this kind of merging or hybridization of two different lineages. So what is the ethical? Is it ethically reasonable and unreasonable? Is something to be discussed by ethicists, because growing human organs in pig cells, which help humans, might be seen by some people as a good thing to do, while creating a human pig or pig and cow hybrid may not be, will not be, I assume. So I think these are deep questions for which the answers are also need to be deep. But I think that depends on whether it helps humankind, does it help sick people, and at that point, I think the ethics discussion can happen.
Yes, sir. Another question is, can we just select a small sample data and simply combine them gradually instead of computing such a big sample in one time?
So if you are talking about the bootstrap approach, incrementally adding data to the bootstrap approach is very complicated because it will simply require so much work. Little bootstrap takes that away, that problem, and it simply takes a few random samples of the data and creates a really good result. I would not incrementally add data to alignment, because you can do that in so many different possible ways that you have to try it thousands of different times. So I think that the little bootstrap is still much simpler and more intuitive approach, because you are computing generally 5 to 10 replicates of bootstrap per subsample. So we found that the savings are just like astronomical by doing that simple approach. I think simple, elegant approaches are much better than ad hoc approaches for which it is very difficult to justify or understand the theoretical properties. So in the case of little bootstrap, theoretical properties are very clear. Asymptotically, it will converge onto the correct solution. And that is very important. And that's why I like Kleiner et al. Paper, who talks about actual theoretical underpinnings of little bootstrap approach in general. It was not directly applicable in some ways to our need for phylogenetics, so we had to make some improvements. But I think that basic method, just like Efron's bootstrap taken by Felsenstein to our field, we are bringing Kleiner et al. Little bootstrap to our field in the same way.
One more question is that, sir, does this time tree, which you have shown in your slide, made up of 100 confident results, or there is any variation?
Yeah, so the time trees that we have done is we have taken all or as many as we could, because it is very expensive to take the data from other people, take the other people's time trees and standardize them and combine them. So our approach is that if we take a very large number of time trees published in the literature in peer-reviewed journals, then if we aggregate them together in a meta-analysis, then the average time tree that comes out would be the best representation of community understanding. So our phylogeny is a best representation of community understanding. And for each node, you get the estimate of time from many studies and also what is the variance around that time. So if you go to timetree.org website and you say human and mouse, what is the divergence time? It will show you maybe 70 studies that have estimated it. Each one may have slightly different time, some may have very different time, but you get an average of around 90 million years. And then you get a standard confidence interval from 70 to 100. And I think that gives you an idea of how much confidence you can have. But we ourselves do not massage the data. We give you what the community says overall. So this is a way to bring the knowledge locked up in research articles directly to your fingertips through innovative way of combining and presenting the work.
Yes. Another question is, does humans evolve from primates or great apes, or are we missing some threads?
So basically humans evolved from a common ancestor with chimpanzee, for example. So humans and chimps had a common ancestor, which may have resembled more a great ape than a human, and that's where they came from. And we know that on the human lineage, many species emerged over time, and many of them, almost all others went extinct. Only one lineage, which is human, modern humans, survived. And so there are always a lot of missing links between human chimp to humans, but that is just normal in speciation.
Yes, sir. So, what are the different ways we can use to learn more about the bioinformatics and Mega as a student?
More ways to learn. Well, if you go to Mega website, there is actually a compilation of 100 videos that many other people have shot on their own of different versions of Mega showing how to do some things. So that's one way of doing it, is to learn about Mega. The second one is to just go to Mega and individually go to each menu item and try to use it. The third is my book, Nayi and Kumar book. The whole book has data sets, examples that you can actually, there are examples that are written in the book, worked out, that you can actually try to reproduce using Mega and the data sets that are available in the Mega directory called Nayi Kumar 2000. So this way you have many different ways of doing that and learn about various different applications. In the future, if I have some time, I will write something more of a tutorial. But some other people have written tutorials on Mega. There is a book called Phylogenetic Trees Made Easy by Barry Hall that primarily uses Mega for the whole book. So you can also get that book and use that to learn Mega. So that's one of the ways, many of the ways to learn Mega.
Yes, sir. So this is last question, though we are receiving so many questions, but I think it would not be possible to address all of them. But this is just one last question from my side, as I have seen your recent research paper is on Mega 11. So what are we expecting? What do we see new in Mega 11 if it is coming in future?
So in Mega 11, our focus was, first of all, on providing better method for dating. So real-time method has now become much, much better in Mega 11 because we have added all of these approaches to estimate confidence intervals, to provide calibration points and calibration densities to timing. That's a major change. The second major change is in Mega 11 is that we found that Mega 10, if you gave it coronavirus data of 30,000 bases and let's say 10,000 genomes, it will be really, really, really slow moving. So we basically cleaned up everything. So now it does very, very quick loading up of data, display of data, and those things, which were something you won't realize it, but actually was a big bottleneck. So we removed that bottleneck. And the third thing we did was the Mega was using, we felt too much memory during likelihood calculations. So we have now refactored likelihood part extensively. So now it uses much, much less memory than before. So those are the three major changes in Mega. So now, therefore, Mega 11 is more able to analyze coronavirus data. You can also add information about the date of acquisition of information. Like in this case, Mega 11 has date of acquisition, like which day was the coronavirus sequence sampled, December 2019, January 10th, 2020. So that added a new feature, which is timestamp feature. Then you can also say where it was sampled, which country, which city. So we added that kind of a feature also. So Mega has become much more useful for, over time we will make it much more useful for pathogen evolutionary studies. Because a lot of people using Mega are microbiologists also.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, sir, and sorry to the participants that we could not attain all the questions. But I hope in the hands-on session you will able to learn more new things. And now I request Dr. Vatal to give vote of thanks to Professor Kumar. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Zishan.
Thank you, Dr. Zishan. On behalf of the organizing committee, I take this opportunity to propose vote of thanks to Professor Sudhir Kumar. I'm indeed indebted to you, Professor Kumar, for having accepted our invitation to deliver the keynote address in the inaugural session of the National Workshop. As mentioned earlier, it was indeed demanding too much from you to have requested you for a talk on late Sunday night. I'm sure all the registered participants, as well as all those who are attending this lecture on YouTube, are grateful to you for such an illustrious keynote address. The Wuhan story about the grandparents of the present-day coronavirus was indeed a great revelation. The lecture was totally engrossing and extremely interesting. The bootstrap fits detailing was absolutely astounding. Another point of great relevance, which I would say was more a take-home lesson, it was the concept of green computing, which was indeed intriguing and high time we take the switch. We at Zakir Hussain Delhi College are really tempted for another lecture and look forward to another opportunity to invite you to college for an offline lecture next time whenever you are in India. Thank you once again. Now I invite Dr. Ruchi Veer to take the proceedings of the inaugural session further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Good morning, everyone. Dr. Gajendra P.S. Raghava has already joined the session. However,